both have her support and also her thinking on all this stuff as we tried to sort out what it looks like to parent in a pandemic.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so Andy and I do a lot of collaborating together. So it was a natural fit for us to be talking about some of the things that we were going through as parents, and then to think about the parents in our congregations and to note how stretched a lot of them are, and just like we are feeling, balancing work with home life, and the reality that for some of us, the first couple of weeks that we were going through this shutdown and stay at home, some of us may have kind of relaxed some things and kind of said, hey, we're just going to throw caution to the wind. Things are fun. Things are different. And the longer we got into this, it felt more like a grind and more like we really needed to figure out how we were going to move forward together. So we were kind of motivated to provide both some support and some hope to parents as this continued to extend, and we realized that it was not going to be a short-lived kind of thing. We wanted to provide some biblical grounding and to remind all parents, including ourselves, that the Bible and God have so much to say that helps us and encourages us. We debated over a lot of topics that parents might want to address, and ended up choosing 4 because we felt that 4 weeks was about as long as parents could invest at this point. We wanted to honor their energy, honor their needs, and also just provide a place where they could realize that they're not alone. That's what Andy and I value in each other a lot of times. And that is indeed, if I had to say one thing that I think the parents in our groups expressed more than anything, was the chance to be with other parents and talk about how everybody was feeling so that nobody felt they were alone. And there were a lot of shared experiences and shared wisdom throughout the group. So Andy and I looked at the things that we could give. We each have specific gifts and areas of interest and expertise. We also looked at the things that we were feeling and that we were sensing out in the community. And the topics that we felt we wanted to talk about were, first, that idea of not being alone. Second, about anxiety, our own anxiety as parents, the anxiety that builds in our kids, and where it might come from, what its roots are. About routines, because a lot of what's happened in this pandemic is that we really have needed to reset our routines and think carefully about what we want in those routines and what we don't. And then lastly, discipline. And, you know, you could say that anxiety, routines, and discipline are topics for any time. But certainly right now in this pandemic, I'll speak at least for my kids, they're kind of going, oh, we're not in school. And so for a while there, it was, oh, bend the rules and we don't have to do as much. And I realized very quickly that if I was going to work and I needed to have the routines, and I needed to think carefully about how I might adapt discipline for this time. So where there are lots of topics, different groups and different professionals might choose different things, but these are the ones that we felt we could give good idea and thought to and invite discussion on. And so our purpose today with the PRC is to give an overview of what we did. For those of you who are parents, there will be some helpful nuggets that you'll be able to hold on to and to think about and to pursue in your own time. And of course, to ask questions about in our breakout groups. For those of you who are professionals in ministry who are looking at leading perhaps a class like this, there will be opportunities for you to see kind of how we developed what we did and consider what you might bring to your own kind of class. So hopefully we'll kind of merge both of those together and give everybody a good experience this afternoon looking through some of this. All right, so any questions that you have, you can certainly chat in. Rhoda is watching that, I know, and she is ever adept. And I will try to keep an eye on that as well. We'll stop periodically, as I'm doing now, to just see if there are any questions that anyone has so far. I'll stop again after I go over the first week that we did. And then Andy will do the second week. We'll do our first breakout. And then we'll do week 3 and then week 4 and do our second breakout session. So you'll have time in those breakout sessions to discuss the content we've talked about, to ask questions, to think out loud about how you might lead this in your ministry setting, any of those kinds of things. All right, so I'll pause for one more moment. Any questions at this moment that you'd like to chat in? Okay. If any come, just go ahead and put them in there and we will address them. All right, so the first night we went over the concept that you are not alone. And each night we started with scripture. We wanted to really build trust. And one of the things that is challenging to do in an online format is to build that trust among some parents who know each other and some parents who don't. We had folks from both of our churches. We had some outside folks in the community that our folks invited. And so not everybody knew each other. So it was important that first night to give us a grounding and also to get to know each other a little bit and to establish that trust. So the scriptures we used the first night, and he's going to bring them up and I will open and read them to you. So we started with Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. We hope that this would be a great comfort for the parents, the idea that Jesus understands what all of us are going through, that he managed to get through his own temptations and struggles, and he will be with us throughout ours, that we are not alone in it, and that we have a whole lot of partnership, not just with Jesus, but with others who are going through the same thing. And that Jesus is our source of confidence, of mercy, of grace, of strength and hope, all of those good things. So this was designed to really kind of put parents at ease and hope that they would see that what we hold true in our faith, that Jesus has been through so much and Jesus is right with us the whole way. And that gives us confidence. And then our second scripture that we used that first night was from 1 Corinthians. No temptation has seized you except what is common to humans. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. One of the realities, I think, is that this time feels very overwhelming for a lot of people, and especially for our parents, as they're being thrust into learning and doing and handling a lot of things that they haven't before. It's why we're seeing so many memes on Facebook and other places talking about how amazing teachers are and how none of us really knew exactly what it was like to be a teacher until this time. And my favorite is the one that circulates about how teachers have been lying to us all these years, that it's not really a pleasure to have my kids in class. And I've thought that on more than one occasion as I work with my kids in this time. So the idea here is that this is an age-old story, that folks before us, the saints of the past, that folks now and folks in the future are all going to be going through challenging situations. And we can take comfort in knowing that we have companionship, friends on that journey, but also that they've made it. We can make it too, and we'll be a testimony to those in the future that they can get through as well. And that the more we keep trusting in God, the better it is. And of course, that reminder that endurance builds up, and I'm feeling that endurance. Also feeling the testing it's taken to get here, which is a lot. So that really went a long way on our first night to starting to generate that trust and that group. And from there, we went on to discuss vulnerability. It was important to talk to parents about where they have felt alone and where they haven't felt alone. And we did some sharing around that. It's also important to ask the question about what makes it hard to be vulnerable. Why do people have trouble joining groups like this? Well, vulnerability is huge. And a lot of our parents expressed how difficult it was to think that they might be judged for their parenting, to open themselves to other people seeing what they were doing and perhaps thinking it wasn't a good idea. I think that's one of the biggest challenges parents face today, is having confidence enough to share who they are without worrying about judgment. So we wanted to create that kind of atmosphere, and we tried to paint that from the start. Brene Brown, many of you heard. If you haven't, please do listen to it. She does a wonderful job of talking about why vulnerability is important, that it's not easy, but we need to be open because that's where we grow. That's where we show our true selves without shame. Shame is a powerful and difficult emotion for all of us to feel. And I talked a little bit about how when we can overcome shame, we have the happy and joyful lives that we want, and that we want to give our children. But we have to overcome it ourselves first. And so by embracing vulnerability, we're able to come to a better level of self-acceptance. So I used a few quotes about it in the class that evening, and talked a little bit about how my kids just hate it when I put on music and go dancing around the kitchen, just having a good time, being myself, relaxing after a day, and how they would never want that to be broadcast outside of our house. And yet at the same time, when they tell stories about me, those kinds of stories are the ones that pop up first. They love to hate that and hate to love it both. So we can teach our kids good ways to be vulnerable, and in that vulnerability be able to be open to new learnings and growth for ourselves, and to connection with other parents and other people on our journey in ways that are very real and very authentic and very helpful. So once we talked about all that together, then it was amazing how easy it was for parents to open up and share what brought them, what inspired them to come and take part in this group, and what they most needed in their lives at that time, to be able to share those kinds of things with each other, and to be able to ask for that support from the group, whatever they might have needed. So it was a wonderful first beginning, and then we closed that night by talking about two things. How we continue to deepen our relationship with God as a way to answer that, and how to check our support network of relationships. During this time, we have a great opportunity to develop new patterns and disciplines that really help us and support us and work for us. And that's one way that we can deepen our own vulnerability, is to open ourselves to new growth and trying new things that become part of our routine and that change the dynamic of our families. And the second was to look at a network of relationships that we have and maybe a place where we need to deepen. Andy, I think we have a slide on this. Is that right?
I didn't have a slide on that per se.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought there was an overview slide for those two. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I do. I'll throw that up.
Okay. All right. So in order to embrace that vulnerability and know that we're not alone, we were encouraging parents to work on their own relationships with God and the patterns and disciplines that would help and support that, as well as to look at their own support network. And we talked to them about different types of support they might find. Things like people in their lives who are the encouraging, caring, supportive kinds of folks with whom they can share their joys and sorrows. And someone in their support network who is that might not be the same kind of person who helps them problem solve. They might have other folks in their lives who help them problem solve. Or still other folks who tell them what they need to hear, even when they don't necessarily want to hear it, to give that reality check of saying, wait a second here. Did I really come across the way I meant to? Was I too harsh on my kids in that moment? That all of these kinds of support are helpful. And that as we look at our family and our friends and folks we know at church, as well as colleagues, and then professionals, whether therapists or spiritual directors, that they all provide different kinds of support to us. And so we encourage parents to start thinking about who's in their support network and what roles those folks play, to understand that they have resources, some that they may not have thought of, but also that there may be places where they don't have as many people there to support them in certain aspects of their lives. And they could be actively looking for people to fill those gaps. So that was our whole first evening with them. We did about an hour, and we thought it was going to be an hour and a quarter. It more ended up being an hour and a half each time. So I'm going to pause there for a minute and see if anybody has any questions about that first evening or any of that we presented. Okay, no questions in the chat that I see yet. Andy.
Okay, so the second big topic that we felt was important to address for folks who are parenting in a pandemic is our anxiety. And just a quick show of hands, either on screen or virtually with your raise hand button. How many of you would you say this is a top challenge during this time, either for yourself as a parent or for those who are in your circle? Yeah, yeah. My sense has been that aside from those who are feeling the direct impacts of the virus in terms of illness or the financial impacts, anxiety is probably the most challenging one. And so I felt like it would be important to address this. And it was an opportunity to address in a substantial way. Of course, anxiety is something that Scripture talks about in any number of occasions, and we could draw on any number of verses. But one of the most profound, I think, and challenging is in Philippians, where Paul says, "Do not worry about anything. Do not worry about anything. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." And so that's the promise that our faith has for us, is an opportunity to have our anxieties resolved through what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. And yet, that's not the context that we live in that enables that kind of anxiety and calm, anxiety diminishment and calm. Here's a great quote from Edwin Friedman, and it's from his book called A Failure of Nerve, which is a book I really strongly recommend. He says this about our context. He says, "I believe the raging anxiety storms of our time have led to a highly reactive atmosphere pervading all the institutions of our society. It is something in the air that affects the most ordinary families, no matter what its background." So it's interesting to note this was written in 1997. And I think these raging anxiety storms of our time that he's talking about have only grown stronger and more intense. And that's really before the coronavirus pandemic hit. So the question is, how do we address our anxiety when the world around us and the circumstances which we face leave us so prone and vulnerable to anxiety? So I want to talk with you about a way of thinking about our emotional life that you may or may not have some introduction to, but it's called family systems theory. And just join me on this journey for a few minutes, because I think it is something that will be really helpful in understanding what's going on, and also provide a path forward. So a brief, keep in mind, this is like a whole seminary course that I'm going to try to condense in 5 minutes. Okay, so bear with me. So according to family systems thinking, in any relational system, anxiety is contagious. All right, and I used that word that was not Friedman's word to kind of tie into where we are right now. But anxiety is contagious. It can be passed from one person to another in any relational system. And the more intense the emotional connections in that system, the higher the likelihood of transmission. So it's kind of like in coronavirus times, like we know that the more people that are packed into a smaller space, the more likely you are to get it. The same thing is true in relational systems, that the higher intensity of the emotional connection, the more likely you're to transmit anxiety from one to another. Of course, the highest intensity systems we have are our families, our nuclear families, but also our extended families. So in family systems thinking, those who express symptoms are often not the root cause of those symptoms. And so Friedman and others will actually call that person the identified patient, distinguishing the fact that they're showing symptoms, but they may not be the reason why there is a lack of health. If you think about our own bodies, if you are experiencing shortness of breath, the problem might be in your lungs, and the lung is at fault. But the problem could also be your heart, and the lungs are simply expressing those symptoms. Similarly, in our family systems, the person who's expressing a symptom of that anxiety may not be the actual source of the problem. Likewise, other family members can be asymptomatic carriers of that anxiety. All right, so let me put it in a diagram for you. So here we have a basic family system, 2 parents, 2 children. And the gray cloud around it is sort of the shared emotional content of that family's life. And what happens when there's an increase in stress, and that could come from within the family, maybe an illness or loss of job. It could come from outside the family, like say, I don't know, a pandemic. As the stress burden is raised, beyond tolerable levels, what often happens is there will be a person or sometimes multiple people within that family who exhibit symptoms. Could be a child, for example, who is all of a sudden throwing wild tantrums. I don't know if you guys ever have any problems with temper tantrums. Never happened in my family. And so what happens is families often engage in cycles of trying to treat the symptoms in that child. And that's a good thing to do. We don't want a child to constantly be dealing with temper tantrums or whatever it might be. But often the overall cause is left unaddressed. And when we get into that kind of situation, we often have a lot of unhelpful ways of dealing with our anxiety. So a couple of those unhelpful behaviors, which incidentally also serve as good signs, sort of canaries in the coal mine of we've reached intolerable levels of anxiety in our family, would include reactivity, okay? A pattern of intense reactions to events or to one another, right? And you think about those sort of automatic responses where it's like, I didn't think about how I was going to respond first. It just sort of blah, came out. Herding, which is sort of a protective measure where no one's allowed to say anything, do anything, or think anything else. The more extreme the herding, usually the more extreme the anxiety. Blaming, quite frankly, we're seeing a lot of that in our wider culture these days, right? We're pointing our finger at someone else and sort of fixating on this cause of our pain that comes from somewhere else. And a nice little companion to the blaming is the quick fix, right? Oh, if we just do this or try this trick, use this technique, think about all of the parenting fads that have come and gone in the last few years. Those are some examples of a quick fix. Right? Oh, it's the whatever. I can't think of any specific examples right now, but you can probably think of them for yourself. All right, so just take a moment and reflect. We're not going to have time to share these aloud, but what are some of these signs of high anxiety that you see in yourself or in your family, and particularly maybe have been evident in the last few months? So to the degree that you see some of these tendencies, that would be a good sign that you've reached a threshold of anxiety in your family system that is that's past the point of easy tolerance. And certainly there are a lot of understandable reasons why any family, even when you're not in a pandemic, would be experiencing anxiety that would be very high. Okay, so typically what happens, the standard pattern is that eventually we sort of decide to take action, often through one of those four options. We try to address the symptom, and then the symptom goes away for a while, and yet the chronic anxiety remains. And because of that, often what will happen is a symptom of anxiety will reemerge, often in a different form or in a different person. But if you think back over your family or the families in your congregation over a series of years, if you can see a pattern of symptom, attack the symptom, a period of calm, a new symptom, attack the symptom, period of calm, that might be a sign that there's chronic high anxiety, and that you're not really ever quite getting to the root of what's causing this dynamic in your family. Now, when I was first reading about this, it really made me feel quite depressed, because it's like, okay, well, what do we do? And the good news that family systems thinking gives us a really positive way to move forward, and it's actually pretty well aligned with our faith. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about, okay, so what's our way forward as parents in a time of high anxiety? And really, the way forward is personal growth. You might say personal transformation, which is really what our faith is about, isn't it? And in the context of parenting, it's about becoming a family leader who is both non-anxious. That is, particularly when you're in an anxiety-prone environment, you yourself are able to remain non-anxious. Clearly defined, you know who you are, what you're about, and you're fully present with the others in your system. And being both non-anxious and fully present is really the trick. It's one thing to be non-anxious by removing yourself entirely. And sometimes, when you're in the heat of the moment as a parent, it's like, look, I just need to step out and take a breath. And that's a good thing, because we're reducing our anxiety. But in the grand scheme of things, we want to find ways to reduce our anxiety while remaining connected with our family. In other words, if we really want to address the root cause of this cyclical nature of these unhelpful patterns, it's about our own presence and being. Gee, if only we had some way with our faith to really help with that, right? But it's about taking responsibility for one's own reactivity and destiny, while at the same time remaining connected in the family system. So what does that look like in a specific incident? And we've thankfully have a lot of help from brain scientists to help us understand what happens, thinking specifically about our tendency to reactivity in an anxious and stressful situation. And so what tends to happen is there's a trigger event. You don't cause the event, it's happened. And typically there is about 6 seconds from the onset of that event to chemical hormone releases in your amygdala that kick in that fight or flight response. That's an emotional, instinctual response. And then typically what happens is that from that instinctive response, we then develop an involuntary or a habitual reaction to it, right? That's the outburst, or it's the bursting into tears, or it's the whatever, which often will yield an unhelpful result. Unhelpful in that it doesn't actually reduce the anxiety. It might attempt to avoid it or pass it along. And all of that goes to reinforce this patterned response. And then so the next time that the trigger event comes up, the same pattern happens again. And like a pathway, the more often that you follow these patterns, the more automatic and more likely to happen it becomes. And so what family systems theory and brain science suggests that is possible and often desirable is to find a way to interrupt that pathway. That once that instinctive emotional response has struck, that rather than moving directly into that involuntary or habitual reaction, you begin a new pathway with a response that helps to moderate those emotions and develop a thoughtful and reasoned path forward. And the really good news is that when a leader does that, it actually has the effect not only of taking control of their own anxiety, but it has a ripple effect on the rest of the household, on the rest of the family. So the family leader takes responsibility to decrease their own reactivity and increase their own tolerance to the stress. And I've represented that here with this sort of little lighter colored cloud. And that in fact creates a positive emotional field that begins to moderate the anxiety in the overall system. And then ultimately, because you've now created a change in the overall system, it creates a possibility of lasting relief. So the big question then becomes, how do we as parents pursue a path? How do we as leaders, for that matter, pursue a path of reducing our own anxiety and our own automatic responses to the anxiety around us? And isn't it wonderful that we have access to a being who we've come to know through scriptures, who is non-anxious, clearly defined, and fully present with us through Jesus Christ. And that's what the scriptures try to invite us into a relationship with God. So as we connect ourselves with the non-anxious, clearly defined, fully present God, we have the ability to also then, therefore, be non-anxious, clearly defined, and fully present. And so, the real path forward, I think, is to connect with God in deep and meaningful ways. And we can do that within ourselves through personal spirituality. We can do that in the created order. If you wonder why taking a walk seems so vital these days, I think a big part of it is because it just puts us in God's world and gives us some space to connect with God. And then finally, the presence of God in others through talking with mentor, playing, laughing, having fun, reading or listening to music, and enjoying the ways that God has worked through the art of others. Back to Philippians 4, it says, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And this path to personal transformation that reduces our own anxiety is in fact a really meaningful way, although not a simplistic one, a very meaningful way to move forward in that journey.
Any questions for us before we head to breakout groups? I think we'll do about 10 minutes, Rhoda, in breakout groups. So anybody have any questions before we head that way? Okay.
Okay, welcome back. Hope you guys had a good conversation. Um, and you know, I don't know, Kimberly, if you want to share a little bit about what you were talking about. We ended up actually talking a lot about routines, which is
Oh,
topic, yeah, which is about the topic.
which is what you're about to do.
Topic. So, would you like to share with us any just a brief overview of what you guys discussed?
We talked a little bit about how to structure these kinds of things, some of the practical aspects, and some of the other curiosities about how to do this in your own ministry setting.
Cool.
Our group went more and had a conversation about that.
Nice. So, so we're going to talk now about routines and the opportunity to reset our routines. This will be hopefully more of a brief conversation, and then Kimberly's going to follow that up with adapting our discipline. So I'm going to share a couple of scriptures with you. One comes from the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, talking about the Sabbath command. God says, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." And just note how slavery and not being able to have a routine where there was rest involved are really closely connected. Likewise, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So the opportunity for routine is one in which it provides structure in order for us to connect deeply with God and one another in life-giving ways. But we know that often those patterns don't often, maybe I should say, don't always give us the life that we would like. And something that we were talking about in our breakout was the way personal and family routines have been upended. And so, again, just for private reflection, we don't have time to discuss it right now, but what are some of the ways that those routines have changed for you? What has been lost? What has been gained? And I imagine if you took a few moments to reflect and write those things down, you might be able to come up with a pretty robust list on both questions. Part of, I think, what this pandemic has caused us to recognize is that we tend to set routines without really being terribly intentional all of the time. A lot of times it's out of either convenience or necessity, like we're just trying to survive and trying to get by. But the truth is, routines have the power to shape our lives and our hearts. Remember what we talked about before of those pathways? Well, the habit is another form of pathway. And the longer we walk in a particular habit, the more likely it is to shape our very selves. And so, we can think about those pathways, those habits, those routines, the ones that we had before social distancing, but even the ones that we've established since then. And ask, do our routines and habits lead us to become who we want to be? Does it lead us to love what we really want to love? And so, the opportunity during this moment, particularly as we look with a few months of experience of social distancing, and look into an uncertain future of when we might return to any sort of normalcy. To spend some time and do the evaluation of our family or personal schedule, thinking about, spiritual and emotional factors. Where is there time for those things? Physical wellness, both our tendency toward disease, if we have any right now, but also things like diet and exercise, our professional educational lives, and our family and social interaction. All four of those are important factors in our overall well-being. And asking the question of whether our routines as an individual and as a family are supporting health in those areas is really important. Again, so often we're so caught up in sort of what I have to do right now. We don't take a step back and evaluate, what our daily steps are leading us toward in the long run. And so an encouragement for you and also for the folks that you're ministering to would be to think through those things. It's a really wonderful opportunity as everything's been flipped upside down to think through those things. One of the folks we were just talking about says, there are a lot of families whose lives revolved around sports. Well, guess what? There's no sports right now. What a nice opportunity to evaluate, what gifts there are when your life doesn't revolve around sports. What areas of our well-being need attention, and how can our routines be adjusted in order to take some positive steps? And of course, this is one big area of our lives, thinking back to the anxiety piece, that we do have control over. We don't have to do all the things that everyone says we have to do. And we can make positive decisions to do things that others might say, oh, that's not a big deal. But if those routines will lead us toward the sort of life that God wants for us, that'll be a wonderful thing in the long run. And of course, if we don't shape our routines will shape us. Questions or comments about that segment?
I have a couple that came in by chat. Do you have some examples about resetting routines? And also, what are like smaller incremental steps that could be taken towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the first question, the smaller incremental step. I would say, if you look at, these four factors, if you were to pick one area that needs some attention, let's just say physical wellness. And right now in my daily, weekly routines, there's not a lot of attention to physical wellness. I might say, okay, how can I think about setting a routine that will enable my physical wellness going forward, and attempt to start a habit, or attempt a few different ways to do that. So, for example, one of the things that's happened almost every day since we were in pandemic mode was my wife and I go for a walk every afternoon. It's about a 45-minute walk, sometimes a little longer, depending on how much time we have. And that's something that I hadn't been doing before. Of course, there's a little bit of spiritual, emotional wellness in there, and a little bit of family wellness in there as well. So sometimes you can get a bonus and hit on some thoughts that accomplish multiple things. But I think that would be the incremental step would be to sort of, it's really challenging to think about, resetting your entire routine, for yourself, let alone your whole family. So to pick one area that needs some attention would be the way to go. Kimberly, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you did a great job with that, Andy. I would say that one of the things we invited our folks to do was to, if they felt up to it, look at a whole week and look at the things that they were normally doing, just to kind of write down what they had a sense of was already going on in their lives. And that even just the act of writing down what you're currently doing and kind of color coding it as to what it might be hitting on these different areas of your life gives a sense of here's where I am. Then there becomes a choice of where do I want to go? Is there one color that's here too much? Is there one color that's not there enough? So that can also be a way to approach a whole routine without feeling like you've got to bite the whole thing at once, but just to start by assessing what is now and what you like and what you don't like about it.
So here's an example of that handout, literally created in about 10 minutes right before the first time we offered this class. So it's not very sophisticated. It just breaks each day into segments, and then invites reflection on those different factors, to write down where you're doing certain things that and attend to those specific factors. And that worksheet could then give you a chance to sort of think through, where there might be gaps or where there might be opportunities to add elements. Notice the overnight section. One of the areas of routine that for some reason in our society has been really, really poorly attended to is sleep. And incidentally, lack of sleep and low tolerance for anxiety go hand in hand. So if you're feeling very anxious, one of the best things you can do is regularly get a good night's sleep. You'll have a lot more energy to handle the anxiety that comes at you. Okay, Kimberly, you want to take a step 4?
Yeah. All right. So the last week we did was discipline. And of course, we found that the week on anxiety and the week on discipline were both pretty loaded weeks and yet very good discussions. If you have a group on which you could take more time, those both might be areas where you could expand. But part of what we talked about in my group was parents even having time for a little bit. So with discipline, one of the first questions we asked was, how's discipline going in your house right now? Just to kind of get a sense of where people were and to have a little shared laughter together about discipline. Oh yeah, that, it was a wonderful moment with a group that had become fairly connected and could be open and honest with each other in a lot of ways. So that was great. But then we talked about what discipline really is. A lot of times we treat discipline as a way for us to reduce our own anxiety. Okay? Like, I'm on a webinar, why are you knocking at my door? If you've been watching me at all, you know that I've had to open the door a couple times now for my 11-year-old who needs things. Why are you opening my door? Okay, just go do whatever. I don't care what I said before I got on this webinar. Just go do whatever so I can be calm and present in my webinar. It's what we do. It's what we are. It's one of our coping mechanisms right now. But it's also discipline that is aimed at reducing my anxiety instead of discipline that's going for what it's really meant to be. And throughout this, we tried to acknowledge that there are lots of things that are going on because it kind of has to be that way right now. And there's nothing bad or horrible about the fact that we are going to be reactive sometimes, and the fact that we are going to parent with an eye to reducing our own anxiety rather than our kids' well-being at times. This is normal. On the other hand, what we were trying to help all of us as parents think towards is being more thoughtful and intentional. As people of faith, when we say the word discipline in that context, in the context of a Lenten discipline, or in the context of something else that we might be doing, we're thinking about a positive forming and shaping exercise, whether it's a habit we adopt, whether it's a new pattern we try, something that is going to help us become who God has created us to be. That's how we use the word in the church. But it's the same thing for our kids, isn't it? I mean, discipline is helping to form and shape them into the wonderful people God has created them to be. and each of them is different. So where I might have a basic baseline rule for my kids of we are going to make sure that we have some family time together every day, no matter what that may look like. I adapt that with each of my kids a little differently. With my teenager, our afternoon walks work because she doesn't like to be looking at me. She just wants to be doing something while she's talking. And that is a wonderful formation time for us to talk about stuff that's on her mind, to talk about stuff that's on my mind, to make decisions together about how we're moving forward. On the other hand, my 11-year-old can do that, but she really prefers when I sit down with her face to face and have that family time. And that's where we do some of that forming and shaping. It's not that I'm punishing, it's that I'm sitting and listening to them about what's important to them. And I'm helping them create a path forward that works for them. And I also at times am bringing up things that are bothering me about the way our family life is together. And that's one option that works for us. A lot of times when we are doing discipline without thinking about it, we are doing discipline that gives us a short-term gain, some peace and quiet, an ability to finish our work, or whatever that immediate pressing need might be. But we are gaining ourselves long-term pain because we're setting up some things that are going to be problematic to come back and deal with later. We might be going back on things that we have said previously. What we want to be thinking about is how we help discipline our children for long-term maturity, for growth and responsibility. And that means that there's often going to be a short-term pain involved on our part when we really have to kind of dig in and give a little bit more than we might otherwise. I shared with the group that about a week and a half ago, my younger daughter was on a conversation with her friend, and they were having a whole lot of trouble talking to each other. And so I gave up what I was going to do that morning, and I sat down and really helped them work through some stuff. That was some short-term pain, but hopefully it's some long-term gain to help them really come to understand each other better. So briefly, what we went ahead and did about discipline is we talked to our families about vision and values. What if discipline could be based on our vision for our family? What do we want our family to be? What do we want to be the family known for? You know, how do we want our kids to describe our family? Our family's about this. Our family focuses on that. We parents set that vision, hopefully with all the parents who are parenting working together, whether it's one or two, or if there's a good relationship with a step parent too, excellent. Following on that, what if discipline then reflected our core values? Because out of that vision come values. One of the values that I have for my kids is that just about any opportunity can be a way to learn something. It might be a whole lot of fun. It might be more entertainment in their minds, but we can still be learning no matter what we're doing. And that's a value for me, is the value of learning and education. So when I'm thoughtful and intentional, my discipline, my forming strategies for my children reflect those values that are part of our family. Again, what if discipline took into account how our children are different, yet need similar foundations? So the vision and the values are the same, but we may need to adapt that in different ways depending on the personality of our kids. And then what if discipline abounded with the grace that God already gives us? One of the challenging things for parents is that we are teaching our kids as we work with them. We can be teaching them wonderful things about what God gives us and what we give to them, or we can be teaching them not so wonderful things at times. God gives us so much grace that I think it's really important we learn to pass that on to our kids. One of the ways that I shared doing that was about, we had trouble about making our beds, so I started bringing in a national "you don't have to make your bed" holiday. And I would announce it once a week if needed, or only every couple months if needed, depending on what was going on in my house. And it was instant grace relief. Everybody calmed down, everybody relaxed, it reset the day. that little bit of grace was not much for me to give up. And amazingly now I have no making the bed problems in my house. My girls are actually better at it than I am. So we talked about with discipline that we need to stay away from abuse and away from neglect as two ends of the spectrum, to in the middle stay calm, to reduce our anxiety, to stay connected to them emotionally, not cut ourselves off, and not honor their feelings, and also stay the course, that we've got to be consistent with what we're doing. So stay calm, stay connected, stay the course. So that was where we tried to head with discipline, and then just asking families to talk about it, to talk about what they were considering and thinking about, and what they might move forward on, what they were going to take away from this last session. Each time we asked, what are you taking away tonight? Just to give them a chance to, in a short word or phrase, or a couple sentences, what they were going to be taking with them each time. So that's the last overview, and we gave them a little handout that we worked up, and you can easily make up your own, that helps people brainstorm about their vision and their values, just to start thinking about what for them that looks like as well. And how a lot of them said that their most difficult connection was, how do we take the vision and the values and pull it down to our discipline? And that takes time to think about. We offered them a continuation of time if they needed it. So at this point, we were going to go into a quick breakout, let's say again about 10 minutes, and we can talk about all of these things about routine and discipline and anything else you want to discuss in that group. All right. So our group talked again a little bit about, we talked a little bit about how we ourselves are seeing parenting with some of these aspects and the things that have been helpful for us to think about. So that was a neat conversation. Andy, what about your group?
Yeah, what did we talk about? We talked a little bit about, the slides availability, and also, what it would look like to offer this in the future to other groups. So we did talk about that a little bit. We talked about some of the ways other communities of parents might be dealing with these same issues. There's a question of whether, I was aware of any assistance of this sort for Spanish-speaking families or bilingual families, and to which I said I didn't have any awareness of those. But nice path to expand this, parental help in the future for those who have those kinds of families in their community.
Push comes to shove, I could probably help translate, but it would be some intensive work that I don't have time for this moment. But yeah, that's a need, and I'm well aware that that's a need.
Yeah, I would say, a lot of this is going to be transferable to a lot of different contexts, but there are certainly, cultural and other types of contexts that for other parents might be maybe perhaps more important or important in addition to some of these things. For going back to the beginning, for Kimberly and I, this was really looking at the parents in our own faith communities and also in our own wider, incidentally, last time we did this, we did have multiple people who weren't part of either of our churches who heard about it and signed on. So these are some ways to possibly also reach families outside of your congregations, neighbors. But it came from a sense of just saying that there was a need and trying with the gifts we had to respond to those needs. And, so I'd encourage that model for you. Don't feel like you have to take this as expert advice and find a way to regurgitate it in your groups. Hopefully it's more an inspiration to use what you have to share with folks and meet them at their point of need as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's important for each of us to know our gifts. And I also had shared at the end of our group that one of the things that we didn't get to, Andy, because we didn't have any more time, was to help parents start thinking about, gee, as we start going back to normal, and of course the title of this series for the PRC is Transitioning to Normal. What is it going to look like? What have we realized about our family life in this time? What wonderful things have we found? What not so great things have we found? And as we go back to a more normal, life, what do we want to keep from this time that's been good? What do we not want to keep from life the way it was, that we discovered wasn't all that helpful in the end, or may have been a driver of anxiety? So there's some thought reflection that is helpful too, that, there just aren't enough hours or weeks or any of that. But that was one of the things Andy and I talked a little bit about that we didn't get a chance to address. So that could be another possible thing for your groups. All right. Thank you, Andy, for putting that up. In case you all would like to contact either of us for more conversation, those kinds of things, we did create some of our own material in this, which we've alluded to and referenced, but we don't want to limit your creativity and what you can create as well, because again, everybody has their own strengths and gifts. So if you have any questions or want to do any further conversation, this is how you can reach us.
Thank you very much to Kimberly and Andy for leading this time with us today. Like I said, I'll send out a recording of this as well as the slides for those of you that didn't scribble your notes fast enough. And you'll get their email addresses that way also. So feel free to contact them or contact me if there's anything that we can do as you try to support your congregations and yourselves during this time. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.